What if I told you that while the world was watching the biggest river assault in Europe, one American general quietly crossed the same river days earlier, without massive bombing, without headlines, and without asking for permission? In the final weeks of World War II, when victory seemed close but danger was still deadly real, General George S. Patton made a move so bold that it shocked even his own allies. And it all began in the cold days of March 1945. By early March 1945, Nazi Germany was collapsing from every direction. The Red Army was crushing from the east. American and British forces were advancing from the west. Cities were burning. Supply lines were shattered. But one natural barrier still stood between the Allies and the heart of Germany, the Rhine River. Wide, fast, and heavily defended, the Rhine was not just water. It was the last shield protecting Hitler's remaining forces. Whoever crossed it first would open the door to Berlin. British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery had a plan. A massive, carefully prepared assault north of the Ruhr. Thousands of aircraft, heavy artillery, amphibious véhicules. Weeks of planning. It would be called Operation Plunder. Montgomery believed in overwhelming force. He believed in careful preparation, and he wanted the crossing to be perfect. But General George S. Patton was not a man who waited for perfect. Patton believed in speed, in surprise, in pressure. He believed the enemy should never be allowed to breathe. While Montgomery prepared the largest river assault in Allied history, Patton's Third Army was already racing across western Germany. His tanks moved fast, his infantry pushed hard, and his scouts were constantly searching for weak points. If you enjoy stories about bold leadership, hidden strategies, and moments that changed history forever, make sure you like this video and subscribe now, because what happened next is one of the most daring moves of the entire war. In the third week of March 1945, Patton's forces reached the Rhine near the town of Oppenheim. German defenses were thin. Many units were exhausted teenagers or older reservists. The once powerful Wehrmacht was breaking apart. But crossing a major river under enemy observation was still extremely dangerous. One mistake could cost thousands of lives. Most generals would have waited for orders. Patton did not. On the evening of March 22, 1945, under darkness and cold wind, American engineers began preparing assault boats. There was no massive bombing campaign, no long artillery preparation. Silence was the weapon. Infantry units quietly loaded into small boats. Engines were cut. Oars dipped softly into the black water. Across the river, German soldiers did not expect a major crossing there. They believed the main attack would come under Montgomery in the north. That assumption would become their biggest mistake. As midnight passed into the early hours of March 23rd, the first American soldiers reached the eastern bank. Shots were fired. Small pockets of resistance appeared, but the surprise was overwhelming. Within hours, more boats followed. Engineers began constructing pontoon bridges under occasional enemy fire. By sunrise, a bridgehead was established. It had happened fast, too fast. Patton had crossed the Rhine, and he did not wait to celebrate. He immediately ordered armored units forward. Tanks rolled across temporary bridges even before they were fully secured. Momentum was everything. Speed was protection. Meanwhile, Montgomery was still finalizing preparations for his grand assault. Few people realized it at that moment, but a silent decision made in the darkness of March 22nd and March 23rd would completely change the pace of the war in Western Europe. Patton did not just cross a river. He shattered the illusion that Germany could still organize a strong final defense behind the Rhine. And the world was about to find out. When the sun rose on March 23rd, 1945, the impossible had already happened. American troops were no longer staring at the Rhine from the western bank. They were standing on German soil east of the river, expanding their position with shocking speed. What had been considered a natural fortress had been pierced in a single night. And the most dangerous part was not the crossing itself. It was what came next. German commanders were confused. Reports were unclear. Some believed it was only a small raid. Others feared it was the beginning of a massive breakthrough. Communication lines were damaged. Units were scattered. Many officers had grown used to reacting slowly, waiting for confirmation from higher command. But Patton did not give them that time. Within hours of the initial crossing, American engineers completed larger pontoon bridges. Tanks began moving across in steady numbers. Artillery units followed. Supply trucks rolled over floating steel and wood as if the river no longer mattered. The bridgehead was no longer fragile. It was expanding like a crack in glass. Patton understood something critical. The German army was not just losing territory. It was losing coordination. Their greatest weakness was no longer firepower. It was confusion. So he pushed deeper before the enemy could reorganize. Small German resistance pockets fought back bravely in villages and wooded areas. There were firefights. There were artillery exchanges. But this was not the organized, disciplined defense that had once stopped Allied forces in previous years. Many German soldiers were young boys or exhausted veterans pulled from shattered divisions. Some surrendered quickly. Others simply retreated further east without orders. What made Patton's move even more powerful was the psychological effect. German officers had believed the Rhine would buy them time. Time to regroup. Time to negotiate. Time to stabilize a defensive line. But when news spread that American tanks were already across in force, morale dropped sharply. Soldiers began asking a dangerous question. If the Rhine cannot stop them, what can? Meanwhile, in the north, Montgomery's massive assault was still being prepared with enormous air bombardment and artillery fire. When it finally launched, it was powerful and effective. But something had changed. The symbolic moment of breaking the Rhine barrier had already occurred, and it had happened quietly under Patton. Inside Allied headquarters, reactions were mixed. Some admired the boldness. Others were frustrated that Patton had once again acted aggressively without waiting for a coordinated grand moment. But Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower understood the bigger picture. The crossing had worked. The bridgehead was strong, and German resistance was weakening faster than expected. Patton did not slow down to argue about credit. He issued clear orders. Advance. Encircle. Disrupt. His Third Army began driving rapidly into central Germany. Roads were clogged with retreating German vehicles. Bridges were captured before demolition teams could destroy them. Town after town fell in quick succession. Speed became a weapon sharper than artillery. By the last week of March 1945, it was clear that Western Germany was collapsing at a pace even optimistic planners had not predicted. The German High Command attempted to issue defensive orders, but their control was slipping. Fuel shortages were severe. Air support was almost non-existent. The once feared Luftwaffe was nearly invisible. And still Patton kept moving. He understood that wars are not only won by firepower. They are won by momentum, by forcing the enemy to react again and again until reaction becomes panic. The Rhine had been more than a river. It had been a symbol, and symbols matter in war. Once it was crossed, something inside the German defensive mindset cracked. But the most shocking results of Patton's decision were still ahead. Because beyond the river lay thousands of German troops who believed they had days, maybe weeks, before American forces could reach them. They were about to learn how wrong they were. Beyond the Rhine, Germany no longer looked like an organized battlefield. It looked like a collapsing structure. Roads were filled with retreating columns. Civilians moved in panic. Military trucks ran out of fuel and were abandoned in ditches. Entire units were trying to reposition without clear instructions. And into this chaos, Patton drove forward with relentless speed. By the final days of March 1945, American armored divisions were no longer cautiously expanding a bridgehead. They were racing deep into central Germany. In some sectors, they were advancing dozens of miles in a single day. German defensive lines that had been drawn carefully on maps simply dissolved before they could be manned. One German battalion commander later described the situation as fighting a shadow. He explained that they would receive reports of American forces approaching from the west, only to learn hours later that American tanks were suddenly appearing from the south. Radio communication was unreliable. Telephone lines had been destroyed. Orders from higher command arrived late or not at all. This was exactly the kind of battlefield Patton preferred. Fluid, fast, unpredictable. He instructed his commanders not to slow down for every pocket of resistance. Instead of crushing every enemy unit head-on, many were bypassed and surrounded. Once isolated, these German formations often surrendered within hours. They were cut off from support, cut off from ammunition, cut off from hope. The speed created an illusion that American forces were larger than they actually were. German officers began reporting that they were being attacked by multiple armored corps, when in reality it was rapid maneuver creating overlapping pressure points. Confusion magnified fear. In several towns east of Frankfurt, small groups of German officers attempted to organize last stands. But when reconnaissance units reported American armor already threatening their rear routes, those plans collapsed. Some commanders ordered retreats that turned into chaotic withdrawals. Others chose surrender over pointless casualties. The psychological effect grew stronger each day. It was no longer simply about crossing the Rhine. It was about demonstrating that no defensive position could hold long enough to matter. Patton's Third Army seemed to move faster than German intelligence could track. Bridges were seized before demolition charges could be activated. Airfields were captured intact. Supply depots fell without major battles because defenders believed they were already outflanked. Even German civilians sensed the speed. Stories spread rapidly through villages that American tanks appeared with little warning, often hours after distant artillery had been heard. In many cases, resistance lasted only minutes before white flags were raised. By the first days of April 1945, the scale of surrender began increasing dramatically. Entire regiments were laying down arms. Thousands of prisoners were taken daily. Many German soldiers openly admitted they no longer believed victory was possible. They were not surrendering because they lacked weapons. They were surrendering because they lacked direction. And Patton understood the value of that collapse in confidence. He maintained constant forward pressure. Command posts were moved rapidly to keep pace with advancing divisions. He personally visited front lines, reinforcing urgency. He believed hesitation was more dangerous than enemy fire. Meanwhile, higher German leadership was struggling to issue coherent orders. Adolf Hitler continued demanding resistance and counterattacks from units that no longer had fuel or manpower to execute them. Unrealistic commands clashed with battlefield reality. This disconnect widened the chaos. The deeper Patton moved, the more it became clear that the Rhine had not been the final barrier. It had been the beginning of the end. But there was one more shocking development waiting ahead. Because within just days, large concentrations of German troops would face a decision that would define the final chapter of their war. Fight a battle they could not win, or surrender without firing a shot. By the second week of April 1945, the German military situation in central Germany was no longer fragile. It was shattered. Entire formations were cut off from each other. Supply routes had collapsed. Fuel depots were empty. Communication lines barely functioned. Yet on paper, tens of thousands of German troops still stood armed between Patton's advancing forces and the heart of Bavaria. What followed was not a traditional battle. It was a psychological implosion. As American armored columns pushed deeper, they began encountering large clusters of German officers attempting to regroup scattered units. These officers still wore decorated uniforms. They still carried sidearms. They still technically commanded divisions, but they no longer commanded momentum. Patton understood something critical at this stage of war. When an army loses movement, it loses belief. And when belief collapses, surrender becomes contagious. Near several key crossroads and rail junctions, American forward units made contact with German officers who had expected to defend prepared positions. Instead, they found themselves surrounded faster than they anticipated. American tanks would appear on one road, mechanized infantry on another, recon units cutting off retreat routes from behind. The message was clear without being spoken loudly. You are already too late. In one documented encounter near the city of Kassel, German staff officers attempted to negotiate localized ceasefires to evacuate wounded soldiers. They expected resistance. They expected harsh ultimatums. Instead, American commanders delivered something far more unsettling: calm confidence. They informed the German officers that further resistance would only result in unnecessary destruction, that American forces were advancing from multiple directions, that surrender now would preserve civilian lives. That delay would not change the outcome. This tone mattered, because many German officers by this stage were not ideologically committed to fighting to the last bullet. They were professionals who recognized strategic collapse when they saw it. They understood that the Rhine had fallen. They understood that Soviet forces were closing in from the east. They understood that Berlin itself was under increasing pressure. The war was ending. The only question was how much more blood would be spilled before the inevitable. Patton's speed created the illusion that resistance was pointless. German officers receiving reports from different sectors could not determine where the main American thrust truly was. Every direction seemed threatened. Every delay seemed fatal. Within days, surrender negotiations began increasing in frequency. Entire battalion commanders approached American lines under white flags. Some divisions, cut off and lacking fuel, formally capitulated rather than attempt breakout maneuvers. In several towns, German officers ordered their troops to stack rifles in town squares before American forces even arrived in full strength. This was not merely military defeat. It was psychological domination. Patton did not pause to celebrate. He pressed harder. His philosophy remained unchanged. Momentum must never be surrendered. American units captured bridges intact because defenders chose not to detonate charges. Airfields were secured without dogfights because aircraft had already fled or been abandoned. Armored spearheads continued eastward, collapsing what remained of organized resistance in their path. By mid-April 1945, it was evident that what could have been weeks of brutal urban warfare was instead dissolving into rapid capitulation across wide areas of southern and central Germany. And all of it traced back to that silent night on the Rhine. Had the crossing been delayed? Had it been loudly announced with weeks of preparation? Had it followed the slow rhythm many expected? The Germans might have concentrated their defenses differently. They might have fortified Bavaria more heavily. They might have prolonged the war further south. Instead, the speed broke the spine of coordination. In the final days before Germany's unconditional surrender, thousands upon thousands of German officers and soldiers laid down arms not because they were physically overwhelmed in battle, but because the strategic picture left them no rational alternative. It had taken less than 48 hours from crossing the Rhine for Patton to begin dismantling entire command structures without major pitched battles. And that reality would leave a permanent scar on British pride. Because while Montgomery's massive crossing would be remembered for its thunder, it was Patton's silence that changed the tempo of the war. Only one final chapter remains: the political consequences, the reputations, and a lesson history would never forget. By late April 1945, Patton's Third Army had surged deep into Germany. Town after town fell with minimal resistance. The cities were liberated before the Germans could mount organized defense. Entire regiments surrendered intact. Bridges, depots, and vehicles remained undamaged, handed over voluntarily. It was the culmination of a strategy no textbook could have taught: victory through audacity, speed, and psychological domination. Officers who might have expected weeks of grueling combat found themselves negotiating surrender terms before a shot was fired. Men who had trained to fight to the last round realized that the war had moved past them. Resistance was not only futile, it was meaningless. And Patton's genius had made it clear that hesitation cost lives, while boldness saved them. Meanwhile, Montgomery's Operation Plunder finally commenced as planned, but the contrast was staggering. The British and Canadian armies faced well-prepared German positions, fortified with artillery, mines, and barricades. Casualties, though moderate, were significantly higher than Patton's near-zero losses at Oppenheim. Soldiers who had watched the Rhine crossing from afar could not help but notice that the painstakingly orchestrated attack came days after the decisive blow had already been delivered. The story spread quickly through Allied command. Speed, surprise, and decisiveness had trumped massive preparation and overwhelming force. The lessons were clear for anyone paying attention. In modern warfare, tempo and psychological dominance could achieve what brute force often could not. Entire German units surrendered not out of shame, not from demoralization by combat, but because they could no longer see a coherent front, a line of command, or a mission worth dying for. The implications extended beyond the battlefield. Churchill's private reactions captured the mixture of awe and frustration sweeping Allied leadership. He had always respected the methodical precision of Montgomery, the embodiment of British military tradition. But Patton's audacity revealed the limitations of cautious planning. It was not reckless. It was calculated risk amplified by speed. And the world noticed. Eisenhower increasingly entrusted decisive missions to commanders who embraced similar aggressive strategies. Patton became the embodiment of a new style of warfare, mobile, relentless, and psychologically overwhelming. Commanders no longer relied solely on attrition. They relied on momentum, deception, and the enemy's inability to react coherently under pressure. It was a revolution in practical terms, even if textbooks would not codify it for decades. For the German officers, the consequences were humbling. Generals, colonels, and majors found themselves negotiating surrenders without ever facing the chaos of full-scale engagement. They realized the war's end was not always defined by who fired the last shot, but who moved fastest, struck first, and forced their opponents to make choices under duress. Some later admitted in post-war interviews that the decision to surrender, though emotionally painful, was strategically rational. Thousands of men who might have died in futile defenses were spared because their commanders understood that compliance under duress preserved lives and resources. Patton had achieved a unique victory. He won not just by force, but by creating conditions in which resistance itself became nonsensical. That psychological pressure was as decisive as any artillery barrage. In the aftermath, history would remember both generals differently. Montgomery's methodical approach ensured success in large-scale, predictable operations, but Patton's audacity became legendary. His Rhine crossing was celebrated in war rooms, letters, and memoirs. Churchill's famous comment, calling him the mad cowboy, captured both disbelief and admiration. Soldiers who followed him recounted tales of near-impossible crossings, lightning advances, and the calm, confident presence of a man who believed audacity could bend reality. And perhaps most importantly, the Rhine crossing of March 1945 taught one enduring lesson. In war, speed and initiative often matter more than numbers or meticulous preparation. The boldness to act before the enemy expects it can collapse entire defensive networks, save countless lives, and redefine the course of history. If you found this story as incredible as I did, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and comment below with your thoughts. Would you have dared to cross the Rhine the way Patton did, in complete silence and darkness? Share this video with history lovers and anyone who loves stories of audacity and strategy, so more people can learn how one general's boldness changed the course of a war forever. The story of Patton isn't just about World War II. It's about leadership, decision-making, and the profound power of moving faster than anyone else can react. Remember, audacity wins, hesitation costs, and history often favors those willing to strike when the world thinks you won't.